Hey folks, Rob here with another mission briefing. Haven't done one of these in a while. This is going to be number 6, and we're going to be talking about the Battle of Stalingrad, specifically Operation Hubertus, which was it's really the last German assault in the fight for Stalingrad. And for those of you familiar with Stalingrad, you have a rough idea where it lies. So it's basically southern Russia. Now it's called Volgograd. During World War II, however, it was called Stalingrad, named after Stalin himself. It lies along the Volga in what is now southern Russia. Now, it was a premier industrial city during World War II, and it became a focus of Army Group B's southern thrust. The city occupied a place on a bend in the Volga, and it brought it within 50 miles of the Don River. So the two rivers coming close together was a nice crucial area. As well, to the south of that region, there was the crucial oil fields of the Caucasus, and crucial supplies of oil had been shipping northwards up the rivers towards north and central Russia, and it was believed that capturing the city would greatly hinder the Soviet defense in that region. Again, this is also part of covering the army's attack into the oil fields and you might call personal grudge that Hitler had versus Stalin, and why not demoralize the Russians by taking their famous city named after their dictator. This is a graphic of what Operation Blow looked like, or Operation Blue. The Russian forces in the Caucasus area under Marshal Timoshenko's Southwest Front amounted to around 640,000 troops with 1,200 tanks, and many of them being the superior T-34s. In the late winter and early spring, they had been attempting to deal a decisive blow to the German forces. However, by May of 42, they had been effectively crushed with many casualties, and this almost presented a clear route for Army Group B to approach Stalingrad. On 28 June 1942, the Germans launched Case Blue, and this was the drive to the Caucasus and Stalingrad proper. So the Army Group South was broken down into two, Army Group A and Army Group B. Army Group A's objective was the oil field, while Army Group B was heading towards Stalingrad. So all along the Army Group's front, German units started wading forth, smashing into the Russians. By early mid-September, elements of the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Armies had actually begun to enter the outskirts of Stalingrad, and they'd covered a total of about 300 kilometers from the start lines in June. Almost immediately, German aircraft and artillery began to pound the city, and it became a rubbled mess. You can see there with the kind of terrain that the Germans would have to slog through. The Russians suffered huge losses in their multiple counterattacks called Lubin offensives. There's a series of 4 of these, and they were designed to slow down the Germans, which they did, much to their own loss. So the Russian defenses in the southwest front were going to be hurriedly reorganized into 3 armies: the 62nd, the 63rd, and the 64th, which consisting of 38 divisions in total, which seems a lot on paper, but about 20 of these divisions were actually well below strength. In addition, Stalin had decreed that the city be held at all cost, and with his order number 277, not one step back, it became the Russian mantra for the Russian defense. Now, Marshal Timoshenko wasn't the most intelligent of commanders. He was actually sacked from his position, as well as the inept commander of the Soviet 62nd Army. And on 12 September, the keen and impressive Lieutenant General Vasily Chukov took over the Soviet 62nd Army. The German plans for the capture of Stalingrad involved a primary thrust by the 6th Army towards the high ground west of the city, while the 4th Panzer Army elements would push towards the Volga south of it and attempt to occupy both banks, therefore cutting off the city from the south. On either flank was the 3rd and the 4th remaining armies. Their job was, like I said, to protect the flanks of 6th Army as they dealt with Stalingrad. Once beyond the bridgehead, the 51st Armee-Korps from the 6th Army would actually push into the city proper. So this was a major formation that was dealing with the conquest of Stalingrad. Unfortunately, despite this daring plan, the reality was that the Panzer armies needed fuel, and the Germans were quickly running out. This slowed the northerly swinging arc of the Panzer Army, and so they were not in position, nor would they ever be. The city itself was long and thin and mostly hugging the banks of the Volga. Heavy industries were in the north, while the more urban areas, central city, were in the south center. And despite most of the heavy industries in Russia having been picked up and moved eastward, the factories in Stalingrad were still producing armaments, and there's many stories abounding of T-34s rolling right off the assembly line and directly into battle by their workers against the approaching Germans. So this northern area has been well represented by ASL, and there's at least three HASL campaigns set in around the industrial areas. You had the Red Barricades from Avalon Hill back in the early 90s, Red October recently from MMP, and then you had the Zerhinsky Tractor Factory, and I believe that was from Critical Hit, which covered that region's fighting. I'm not sure about that one. The central area of Stalingrad itself has also been well represented by the excellent Battle of the Guards HASL, which I've played many times, and the many scenarios that are built in and around the city. So there's lots of scenarios and campaigns that cover the fighting in Stalingrad. This is what the orders of battle look like now. The 51st Army Corps, again, they recognized the fact that they needed some specialists. Von Paulus was able to finally convince higher uh, command that the requirement for these pioneers, and so they began to filter in uh, fairly early on in the planning process to the unit. Now, the problem, of course, is while on paper the units seemed formidable, in reality, especially with the pioneers, there was just never enough to conduct the scope of operations required. On paper, the 5 battalions should have equaled 4,800. In actuality, just over 1,700 were only available for the assault. It was also realized somewhat late that the pioneers would require additional infantry support to hold the ground. With 51st Army Corps' resources, they just did not have enough. So once again, they contacted other units and they pulled in various divisions and regiments from them to augment the 51st Army Corps' assault. In addition, there was 12 of these newly built SIG-33Bs made available to help. Now, they are consisting of a 15-centimeter howitzer on a Stug-3 chassis, and it would prove quite devastating to the stone, rubble, and buildings that the Russians were hiding in. However, they had some limitations. First of all, they were cumbersome. Secondly, they were poorly, or I should say hastily constructed, which meant they had a limited means of laying on target. Also, due to the vast amounts of rubble existing on the battlefield, they were very hard to maneuver. All told, the Germans had just over 27,000 combat troops available at the start of Operation Hubertus to 51st Army Corps. The Russians, for their part, were also finding resources stretched to breaking point. During the day, German aircraft and artillery kept the ferrying of troops and material across the Volga down, and this would continue on at night. Once the Germans had reached the shoreline, they were able to begin intercepting more and more flotillas that were trying to make their way across. Russian casualties were beginning to mount. General Lopatin was replaced by General Zhukov, and he had a more robust defense in mind for the city, and he was a quite determined individual, and he got the most out of his troops. Key to this battle is going to be Colonel Ivan Liudnikov's 138th Rifle Division. It was proving very formidable to the Germans, and they could just not muster enough resources to push the Russians out. Fighting was typically room to room, house to house, and the defenders were well ensconced due to the destruction of the city before the assault. And so this nice graphic here from the Osprey book on Stalingrad. This is Operation Hubertus and what it would look like. So you can see the units in blue. These are your German units and their assault. You can make out the German front line at the beginning of the offensive. Again, this is proving very formidable to the Germans, especially the Red House. This is where Liudnikov's headquarters was. And this whole region here would eventually be referred to as Liudnikov's Island. And it just proved very hard for the Germans to try and punch through. Now, the actual assault commenced on 11 November, and supported by these new assault guns, as well as infantry soldiers, the Germans were preparing one last all-out effort to dislodge the Russians from the factory district. So at 0540 hours on the morning of the 11th, starting with a 30-minute artillery barrage, the Germans leaped forth. Now, they quickly realized that they may have bitten off more than they could chew. Losses were quite horrific on the first day. The pioneers themselves lost about 25% of their strength, and they only had 1,750 to start with. So the casualties were already mounting on the first day. Russians, of course, realizing at this point what was going on, were furiously counterattacking themselves. And finally, on the 13th of November, after the Germans had finally captured the Commissar House, which again was another immense fortified building that took a long time to break down, at this point they'd pretty well been spent. Most of their offensive strength had been whittled away, and they more or less reverted to a defensive posture. So this is a quick timeline of events. So 23 August is when the Germans actually began their assault. Remember, in June they'd started their operation, and by mid-August they had the city in their sights. The first actual attacks on Stalingrad were in the central south, in the commercial residential areas, and this is represented by Valley of the Guards historical ASL. Now, on that same day, the actual 71st Infantry Division elements actually reached the Volga River. By 15th September, the 51st Army Corps had actually occupied the heights of that large kurgan, Mamayev Kurgan. And through the rest of September, they began to seize parts of the city, again with many losses on both sides. 14 October, they launched a major assault against the Red October factory. 20 October, it was the last Kotlubin offensive. Again, the Kotlubin offensive was a series of counteroffensives that were directed against the other elements of 6th Army that were still outside the city. So the intent was to slow down the German advance, which they ended up doing. However, they lost about 200,000 casualties in the process. So generally considered a failure. The Kotlubin offensive did end up costing the Germans some time as they approached towards the city. 29 October, the Barricade factory is finally captured. And 8 November, the commander of 51st Army Corps begins to issue orders for Operation Hubertus, and those 5 pioneer battalions are start moving into Stalingrad. As we said, 13 November, the attack began to stall, and at this point, General Seydlitz Kurzbach was more or less content to just grind the Russians down, but this was to really no avail. On the 138th Rifle Division's side, the Russians basically had like 500 personnel for a rifle division, which of course was not a lot of people to cover the area, and they were dangerously low in ammunition. Again, the German attacks on the resupply efforts across the Volga were definitely impacting the Russian personnel. However, they doggedly continued to fight. And then by 18 November, the German attack had actually spent itself, and they switched to a defensive posture. And then, of course, on the next day, 19 November, the entire southwestern front went on the offensive against the Germans. This is called Operation Uranus, with the express purpose of cutting the Germans in Stalingrad off and turning the tables on them. And then finally, on 2 February 1943, after General Paulus had already been captured, orders were issued to surrender, and then German units began to surrender piecemeal. There was still some fighting going on in the days following that the Russians still had to deal with, but generally it was just last gasp efforts to go out fighting, I guess, for the Germans. So what happened? Now, numbers are really hard to pull out for individual operations. I think it's a noted fact if anybody does military research. Generally, numbers are generalized and they cover wider areas or wider date lines than maybe expressly in 4-1 operation. So in this case, from 1st September to 20 November, again, this is when the 6th Army and 4th Panzer were approaching Stalingrad and fighting in it. They'd suffered a total of 46,988 casualties, including 250 aircraft, which is not too bad. They had, I believe, 1,500 aircraft to start, so only losing 250 was a good return. And all totaled, the Germans lost several hundred thousand soldiers. Again, different nationalities, Romanians, Italians, Croatians, as well as Germans were all scooped up in the Operation Uranus. The Russians, for their part, again, September to November, lost roughly 400,000. That was mainly the fighting in the Stalingrad area, and this included Chukov's 62nd Army, which was lost almost 100,000 wounded, dead, and missing, which is a lot. Again, they kept getting reinforced, and the Russians have the capability of having almost limitless manpower out east, so they were just filtering units. Now, in the course of the battle up to November, about 22,000 Russians were taken prisoner, and the Stalingrad front lost about 200 tanks and another 600 in the north, which pretty well depleted their tank resources, as well as 1,500 aircraft, again, to the Luftwaffe's 250. That's probably a good return for the Germans. So these are the sources I used for my mission briefing. If you're into military history, you may have some of these already. Again, the Osprey Stalingrad series of 3, written by Forshek. You have the David Gallant's report from 2008. Again, it's a nicely detailed article in the Slavic Military Studies Journal. And there's other books there again. Another one I really like is Island of Fire. It's quite detailed, day by day, fight for Liudnikov's island. So it's very detailed. It's quite meaty for a book for such a relatively small action. But again, highly recommend it. Island of Fire. And there we have briefing number 006. This is Operation Hubertus. Again, the last major German offensive inside Stalingrad did not achieve their objective. It's generally considered a failure. And because the attrition that was caused, the Germans found themselves actually in a poorer position than when they had started. They thought that ferrying in some expertise from the shape of the pioneers and the assault guns would help. Again, the Russian defense was just too dogged and too determined to ferret them out. And as a result, it didn't end up very good for the Germans. Then, of course, on the 19th, the Russians launched their own counteroffensive, encircling the pocket. And then they just had to whittle away at it, which ended up happening on 2nd Feb. So, yeah, that's the mission briefing. Hopefully you found it informative and motivated to play. Normally at the end of these, I show you a bunch of scenarios around the action on Scenario Archive. However, I think we all know what's out there because, again, at least three campaigns exist in the ASL world. Probably a couple of other ones that I'm not even aware of. And of course, there's hundreds of maybe thousands of scenarios dealing with various actions that happened in Stalingrad. So we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.